Hilary, when I read your books, I always feel, from the sensory nature of your descriptions, that you've been there, whether it's a South African prison or a barge on the Thames. In that passage, there seems to be a description of what almost seems to be a physical transformation before the words come. Now, we know that you researched meticulously, but something else seems to be taking place here. Can you describe the process which seems to move from this sensory feeling to the words, if that is indeed how that happens? That seems to be the description in the novel. The flesh sort of made into words.
I think the transition point is to do with viewpoint, who's telling the story. And I remember when I began Wolf Hall, and I had no idea when I sat down to write that morning how the book was going to sound, or really what viewpoint the story was coming from. But I had a voice in my head. I had a voice saying, "So now get up." And when I listened to that, I realized the voice was above my head. Then a picture formed, and the picture was a sideways angled view of a boot. It was a close-up. It was the stitching of the boot. It was a knot in the twine of the stitching. And the cobbles, then you feel the cobbles under your cheekbone, and then you can't see anything because there's blood in your eyes. And so the way I described it at one point was that in a simple twist of being, I was inside Thomas Cromwell's body. And he was a 15-year-old boy lying on the cobblestones with a sense that death is imminent. And then all the decisions about the novel have been taken. Where is the story coming from? Well, from behind his eyes. No question of who's in charge of the narrative, because he is. No question of what tense to use, because when is this happening? It is happening now. So, in that act of sliding inside another character's body, a character's body, or a person's body, you should say, if they're a real person, that is the mediation. And that trick, the sliding inside, has to be repeated again and again and again. Many of your characters are simply functional characters. 90% of them don't require anything like that effort. But for the characters who do, I find the transition is instant, or it will never occur.
When you say, so let me just pick you up on something. When you say again and again, do you mean every time you go back to that character? Or is once you've got the character, is that character there for the duration of the writing of the novel?
I think the latter. Once you're inside them, you're always there. But I mean, you may have to repeat it for other characters. You may work with. I do really think of it like that. I don't really think of, I'm going to create a character, or I'm going to bring someone to life. I think, will they come and work with me?
Harriet, I have really the reverse question for you, because you're given words as an actor, they've been written, and you have to embody, transform them into, indeed, the person or the character. And again, when I watch a performance of yours, I'm convinced you've lived in Egypt or Rome or in Elizabethan England, indeed that you made Elizabethan England, in the case of Mary Stuart. Can you describe that process when suddenly someone else's words written on a page become yours, come into your body, so to speak, and how it happens. Is it in rehearsals or at some other time?
It would be great if I knew the answer to that, because I would know that I could reliably go to that routine and produce what it is that I'm supposed to produce. I think that it's going to be different in so many different characters, because I'm totally dependent on the authenticity of the imagination of the writer. And I'm dependent on the research of the writer and the imagination of the writer as to what words will come to my mouth when I see my husband died, or my lover's head cut off, or whatever extreme thing that, for instance, Shakespeare will make you reach for. They've done the research, they've done the work. I then have to kind of go back down the passage that they came forward from and infer their imaginative source. And it depends on them how inspired and authentic I feel about the character. It's interesting, Hilary saying that some characters are purely functional. I've played functional people a lot. The more and more, as I get older, the more you're a function. But on those wonderful occasions when you're required to use your imagination to meet the writer halfway, it can come, I would say, primarily through the language, but I don't know why that happens. It's sometimes a case of music and rhythm that kind of triggers, if the writer's work is right, their intuition of rhythm will kind of infect your intuition of rhythm, and you'll get back to the source, or nearly the source they came from. The rhythm of a different character, the way they speak, the images they use, the speed in which they reply, all those things are tools that I can use. Then there is visual imagination and dreams and the things you're talking about, hearing a voice in your head, suddenly smelling the blood, seeing the cobblestones, all those things, they can trigger your imagination. But then I also know that when I was at school, I remember having a sort of reunion with my school friends when we were 50, and their memories were more or less consensual about certain large events that had happened, and I couldn't even remember them. And I had remembered exactly how somebody walked, exactly how they wrote. I could imitate their handwriting. I knew the shape of their ankles, the angle of their head. It was as though there was some, like you have an instinctive ability, some amazing imagination that can go to that place and see and smell historical moments as if they were now. I couldn't write it down, but I could sort of infer what somebody was thinking by watching the way they walked. And I don't know why that is an inbuilt ability to certain actors. And it was as though my actual body could sort of disintegrate and reconstruct itself as somebody else, just by watching them, and in many cases wishing I was them. So a lot of that goes on.
It's interesting because Hilary, we had a little discussion earlier, and you were talking about watching the RSC adaptation, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, and your fascination with the moment when the character who's on stage, when an actor has played a character, has been that character, and suddenly becomes himself or herself, becomes the man. And you say that has particularly interested you. Harriet, you must have that experience of, you're in the dressing room suddenly, and you are somewhere perhaps between characters. I wonder, I think it might interest Hilary if you talk about that. The moment when the character leaves you really for the night, maybe, and of course at the end of a production.
Yes, I mean, I think by the time I'm in the dressing room, I've got a speeded up hotline to the character. All that kind of process of gradually becoming them happens more in the rehearsal room. And therefore the speed I get into it in the dressing room is also the speed with which I can get out of it at the end of the day. So I don't carry on being Lady Macbeth at dinner, you know. But I'm pretty hard to live with while I'm rehearsing Lady Macbeth, I would say. But it's so difficult to describe and to absolutely codify how the process happens. And obviously there are some people who I find easier to connect with than others, you know. And I cite Lady Macbeth because, fortunately, she's quite a long way away from me, and I had to go on quite a journey to meet her. Other characters come in much more immediately. But playing a historical character is a strange thing, because for a start, you're playing a very edited version of, say, Elizabeth I. You can do all the research you like, read all the books you like for your own interest, but basically your job is to do Schiller's version of Elizabeth I or whoever's, and their function within the play. But then you also have this autonomy, which must be annoying to writers, where you actually sort of you connect with the writer, with the character in a very personal way. That means that your version of Elizabeth I would not be like any other actress's Elizabeth I. And I don't know what that sort of... It's a bit like meeting a person and the chemistry between two people. Anybody here who's had more than one lover or more than one husband, you know, whoever it is you're living with, you are a slightly different person. So it's not that you're not you anymore. It's not that you've abandoned another person, another version of yourself. It's just that there's a different accent to it. There are different bits that touch, and the bits that don't touch become irrelevant, and only the bits that do connect are played out.
It's fascinating to me, because I think there's an analogy with something else that I'm always writing about in fiction, which is public face and private face. I'm interested in those historical characters who step suddenly into the spotlight of history, like some of my French revolutionaries, and what happens to them thereafter. How far are they then owned by themselves, or are they owned by the public, by their spectators? And what happens, of course, to people when they are manufacturing their own legend day by day, when they become self-conscious. And there seems to be a parallel here with the actor on and off stage. Every public man at the end of the day goes home to his private house or closes the door and becomes someone else, or does he? You know, how far does the persona extend? At what point does the mask go onto the face? And there is, I think, often a disconcerting moment 5 minutes after the curtain, when you're not quite sure if your actor has made a perfect conversion back to real life. Or am I actually still talking to Henry VIII?
and perhaps they never quite do. I mean, actors do keep that. We'll come back to this in a bit, but I want to stay with bodies in a different way, because I want to go to the male body, really, and the male mind, if there is such a thing, because both of you... both of you describe... I didn't quite mean that the way it sounded. Whether there is a different mind. Both of you describe thinking you were male or wanting to be male. Hilary, you describe as a child wanting to change into a boy, which you thought would occur when you were about 4. You thought you might become a knight errant, and when you discovered you weren't going to turn into a boy, you described being very disappointed. And there are often descriptions in your novels of the bodily discomforts, not to say the mental discomforts, of being a woman. Harriet, you describe in Other People's Shoes being something of a tomboy, and then how, when your parents' marriage began to founder, you had to pull back, as you say, from the brink of womanhood and dust down your tomboy act in order to win the approval of your father. You started playing boys' parts, particularly in Carol Churchill's Cloud 9, and recently, of course, you've played Brutus in Julius Caesar, and you're now rehearsing Henry IV. So my first question is to you, Harriet. What does it mean for a woman, how does a woman go about playing Brutus or Henry IV? What do you have to do what do you have to do?
Well, it's interesting because what I'm finding is that it reveals how blurred the edge is between being a woman and a man interiorly. I mean, obviously your life experience shapes you, and if your life has been spent as a man, there's going to be a whole lot of things, a whole lot in your vocabulary that isn't accessible to me. But there's an awful lot that is, just in being, I have to say, that if you're given Shakespearean speeches, they are about the great big things in life which affect all of us. To be or not to be is a question for all of us. And so in fact, that's what makes it so rich, is that suddenly, instead of being in a corset and having to just speak about my relationship to a man on the stage, husband or widow or wife or daughter, I'm allowed to talk about the big things in life, which luckily we can now, but in Shakespeare's plays on the whole, the women's voices are not about those things. So it's very liberating. And then, we're not trying to play men and be like men. But it does affect your physical posture and things if your character is endowed with leadership or importance in terms of what you were saying about what other people put on you as a public figure. And Brutus, everybody wants him to be the honourable, noble Brutus. I'm now playing Henry IV, who's less noble, but is nevertheless expected to lead and, be a king. So there's a sense of inherited self-importance, which a lot of women don't have, and which manifests itself in just physically taking up space.
Yes.
and not apologising, and just funny things like that, which we haven't imposed. It would be wrong to impose, but through quite a long rehearsal process, we've discovered in ourselves that we share with men.
Hilary, you've written many novels about women, but your latest novels have been particularly about a man, but mostly about men. Did you have to do anything, obviously not in the way Harriet had to, but to inhabit or write a male character? Does the imagination have to change in some way? Do you have to drop certain habits of the mind, the way Harriet had to drop certain?
I never perceived it as effortful or really as a question. I in my memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, I put the question to the reader: when the midwife says it's a girl, where does the boy go? Well, into fiction, in my case. You see, it's a way of living your unlived lives. I think they confused me when I was a child by saying the name Hilary can be a boy's name as well. So I thought that this desirable change might occur. And I designated all these futures for myself, Knight of the Round Table and Railway Guard and all the rest of it. And yes, there was the moment of sinking disappointment, but then you take up a life in your imagination in which you can live all the other parts of yourself. Not just all of the men, but all the other women that you didn't become. And you can live in all the eras. Yeah. The fact that you happen to be born in a certain place, in a certain decade. The imagination doesn't accept these limitations.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I remember crying. I don't know if anyone remembers the Royal Tournament at Earl's Court. And I used to go every year and see these military parades and these men in uniform. And I used to go home crying because I knew that was one thing I could never, ever be, was a man. And it's not that I have a gender problem. It's just that I suppose being told you couldn't be something was very annoying to a child. And I completely relate to the notion that in your imagination the barriers are gone. I have to wait to be asked to play a part. That's the difference. I can't just go off and do it. But I do know that, again, this thing of watching and imitating, and the reason I was often asked to play boys and could play boys was because I used to just observe them so intently when I was young, when I was a kid, on the beach or climbing trees or doing the things I wanted to do, that there was a kind of physical envy that made me sort of go into their bodies in some way. And I kind of joke, one of my great idols was Rudolf Nureyev, and I used to entertain the dormitory by being him. Yes. It wasn't, never mind I couldn't do the leaps, but I'd suck in my cheeks and pout my lips and look furious and toss my hair, and just everything I'd observed in him, I just wanted to become.
I must tell you that a reviewer, okay, it was the late Christopher Hitchens, paid me, when Wall 4 came out, he paid me what he thought was the ultimate compliment. He said, "You'd never know it had been written by a woman." And I thought that was wonderful. I accepted it in the spirit in which it was meant. But it does mean that people think there is some trick. And he was congratulating me on having done it so swiftly and seamlessly. But actually there isn't a trick. It's one of these things that it probably would become very difficult if you thought about it. But if you don't, it's natural.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to go on with that because it's, also getting on to the lack of female parts, but we'll come back to that later. I actually want to move on to ghosts, since you mentioned ghosts, Hilary, and to darkness. There's a passage in Beyond Black when Alison, the psychic, says, "The fact is, I feel used. I'm put on stage for them to see me. I have to experience for them the things they don't dare. I'm like some form of muckraker. No, I don't mean that. I mean I'm there in the pockets of their dirty minds. I'm like a sewage worker? Yes, because the clients won't do their dirty work. They want it contracted out." This echoes Freud, who says that the spectator at a play has a chance of leading a separate life and can do this safely. Harriet, you talk a lot about the ability of actors to change things, their palpable humanity, you call it, which can lead the audience into a world of the play and to empathy. So it seems to me that here, the writer and the actor have very, very different roles. The writer as the muckraker, the disturber, who stirs the sewers, so to speak, and the actor who leads the audience there in a play, but then has to soothe it or make it possible to look at it Do you agree these roles are different? That, in some way the actor has to find the humanity, the rather lighter side, and the writer has to have the courage to go into that very disturbed area?
I think what Alison, my medium, is saying, I think she says, I'm like a lavatory brush, plunged headfirst into their shit. And she sees herself as someone who helps people to face and acknowledge the unspeakable and the realm of death and destruction, destructive impulses, evil impulses within themselves. And that's the service she provides to the public. So it's not so much a question of stirring things up as, opening those doors people don't want opened. And you do it on their behalf. You can actually, the reader can close the book. They can close the door on the thing they don't want to see. You as a writer had better make sure you can close the door as well. That you can, as it were, protect yourself from your own unspeakable psychic functions. I always imagine that might be more difficult if you're an actor.
Well, I can always blame the writer for the evil thoughts and deeds that I carry out. But yeah, if you're coming from the right place, if you're working honestly, then you are confronting, as an actor, you are dredging from your own imagination. And it's, there's nothing really to be achieved from setting an evil monster on stage and commenting on it. You've got to actually go diving down and finding the truth of that evil monster on stage. And what interests me is the human, therefore I'm not interested in saying these people are the embodiment of evil and these people are the embodiment of saintliness. And finding a connection with somebody selfish, greedy, morally repugnant is a challenge, but you've got to be as honest about that as you are about all the things you wish you were. And when you have sort of when you do think you've arrived at that, what's quite challenging is it sort of arrives at some kind of moral relativism where you say, well, because I understand this person, I understand their motives, is that tantamount to forgiving them? It becomes very shady when you sort of go into something. I haven't had to play a really vicious, I don't know if I was a man to have to play a paedophile or something, but if I had to, I'd have to be as honest with that as I was with playing a lovely princess, and it would confront you with something in your nature that there, but for the grace of certain circumstances, you hadn't gone down that route, but it was a germ in your imagination and your makeup that does exist and that you hopefully keep in check. And you don't say that's them and this is me. It sort of challenges you to become one of them.
Shakespeare gets there quickest, as usual. This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. And once you have acknowledged that the thing of darkness is yours, then the tendency to judge and moralize is lifted. And I think, you make an interesting point, because the idea that to understand all is to forgive all. Shaw said that's the devil's sentimentality. But it isn't part, I think, of the writer's remit to pass judgment on characters, but to stand back and observe and as far as is possible, certainly in dealing with the representation of real characters, to allow them to speak for themselves.
I mean, I want to go from there, in fact, although it's not totally linked, to the supernatural, and go to Lady Macbeth, and also to your many dealings in your novels with the supernatural, what we call the supernatural. Now, you describe in your book on rehearsing Lady Macbeth that you didn't want to have sort of smoke and Hollywood effects, and that you all try to define Macbeth in terms of darkness. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'll come to you, Hilary. You also talk about secrets as a kind of darkness, but please just tell us a little bit about that rehearsal process and how you came to that feeling of being and looking at darkness rather than things coming from somewhere else.
Yes, I mean it's speaking to the converted, I'm sure, but many productions of Macbeth rely on blood and gore and ghosts and thunderstorms and all those exterior things to create fear. And I think Shakespeare's saying the most frightening thing in the world is the human imagination and what it can, and what men can do to other men or women can do to other men. And to me, it's a psychological thriller. It's really just, it's about owning your own malevolence, if you like, rather than exteriorizing it, saying, oh, it's the witches, they've cooked it all up. It seems to be, it's about their projection or a reflection of what's going on inside a very human person. And what I found necessary was to find, again, a really rational, in some way, not rational, but rooted in normality, reason for this, sort of the banality of evil kind of thing, which was a sense of, I've found it, and sure other Lady Macbeth will find it somewhere else, but I found it in I just imagined she'd had many miscarriages and children that hadn't survived, and felt blighted and shameful, and nature hated her and God hated her, and and was coming from a place where what the hell, a sort of place of fury and a feeling of the world owed her something. I was sort of getting into that place, which similarly, I suppose, Macbeth in his way feels. And that became a sort of great human spring of a sort of human emotion that, because they get power, is free to act on,
Well, they are literally in the dark, aren't they? Because Lady Macbeth's the night walker, and Macbeth has murdered sleep.
Yes.
So day becomes permanent night.
Yes.
In quite a few of your novels, there is an unacknowledged darkness. There is a secret. And I'm thinking of A Change of Climate in particular, and I don't want to give the plot away. All the books are on sale, by the way, there. I'm just putting that in while we still have time. Harriet's and Hilary's signed. But you talk about, it's as if the secret, what is not talked about, creates a kind of darkness around it. I mean, it's very hard to describe, but I find it rather fascinating because it also comes up in an experiment in love where, something is not talked about, not remembered, and indeed in Beyond Black, where the memory comes very late. Alison's memory comes very late. In an interview, you talked about the difficulty of writing A Change of Climate because you didn't want to go there. Is that right? It's not quite what you said.
It wasn't that I didn't want to go there, exactly, but I could not. Technically, I didn't seem to be able to get the secret down on the page. What happens in A Change of Climate is that a young couple, and we're talking about back in the 1960s, they go off to southern Africa, and an incident occurs of so ghastly a nature that when they return to England, they don't talk about it because there is a huge barrier of incomprehension between themselves and the people who have never left home. So it functions in their life like Bluebeard's room. It's always there, but you dare not open the door because you know it's covered in blood. And the existence of this secret deforms their family life, even in the next generation. I could not write this book because the secret was resisting being told. And I've never had such a problem with the book where I had finally to wrestle it onto the page through sheer technique. And I did not know that the form of the book would echo the content in that way. I do have, yes, these forbidden areas. In 8 Months from Gaza Street, there's a block of 4 flats, and one of them is the empty flat, in which reside all the projections of the European imagination about what people who live in the East get up to. And there are similar areas of darkness in other novels. Sometimes they are physically delimited geographically. There's a part of Saudi Arabia which is still known as the empty quarter. And that is reflected in the geography of my block of flats. So, yes, you've got an area that people have to walk around because they cannot acknowledge the thing of darkness. It may not always be a case of acknowledging their own nature. It may be that the character is clinging to a set of beliefs about the universe and its benevolence that will be severely challenged if they allow themselves to open the door and look through a crack.
There is a feeling also once you've let something out of the box, once you've given it oxygen, once you've let it out, and you can never put it back. There's that, that Macbeth says, I'm in this so far that to continue would be as,
it's tedious as to go on.
And, there is a tipping point where you've gone too far, and the decision to open that box and let it out is a huge and terrifying responsibility, because you know that life will never be the same once that is public. So the burden to keep it private can rot you inside.
Often people try to protect others by keeping a secret, but what they don't realise is that the very presence of the secret introduces a falsity into life and relationships, particularly in family life. So it works away insidiously, whether the secret is told or not.
Indeed, and there's the opening it up, and we come back to the last question, seems to resolve it and cleanse it, at least resolve it. Some way, we're going to get very, very dark, so I'm going to change the subject before we get spooked. And I want to talk, we have very little time left, because obviously I want to talk about your experience of the stage. With the adaptations of Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. I suppose, what I remember a scene at the end of Bring Up the Bodies where the so-called lovers of Anne Boleyn are called in one by one before Thomas Cromwell. This takes many, many pages and develops very slowly in Bring Up the Bodies in the novel. Now, you were very involved in rehearsals. You were very, very graceful and gracious about accepting cuts. In fact, you helped. Tell us a little bit about your experience of the whole process and really your enthusiasm for it, which is, I would say, surprising, given that a lot of your novel was cut. I mean,
I think Mike Poulton.
I think he's here.
Somewhere.
There.
Yes. Well, Mike was a great mentor and teacher to me, and allowed me to work alongside him for some 3 years and 9 drafts and any number of sub-drafts. And our principal challenge was that we had a novel, 2 novels, highly complex. I think somebody counted 159 characters, and we have some 20 actors to represent them. Oh, we had a huge number of storylines, and we had to select certain characters, certain storylines to carry the rest. The main challenge, I think, was finding out how we represented the inner world of Thomas Cromwell, because everything is seen from his point of view, and how we made that external. One thing, one result of that is that we have an actor who is on stage almost continuously for 3 hours or 6 on a double show day. The way we did it eventually, I mean, I think Mike will bear me out. We tried every technique known to the theatre, and some which were previously unknown. And then in the end we settled for simplicity. And there are occasional moments when Cromwell is alone on stage, but they are quite few. But we do break the fourth wall sometimes, not just for Cromwell. The audience comes to the play with their preconception of what Henry VIII is like, what a monster he is, the great sort of wife killer, the Bluebeard of English history. And then there's a moment when Nat Parker comes to the front of the stage, and he looks, I swear, into the eyes of every person in the house. And he tells you his troubles. He tells you why he wants his divorce. 6 times my wife and I have lived in hopes of an heir. 6 times our hopes have been disappointed. And suddenly, all your preconceptions vanish. And there are other points at which Archbishop Cranmer comes and explains the Reformation to you. And draws you in and makes you part of the problem. So that you are not imposed on, you become part of the show. We are using this device sparingly, but I think it is what all my fiction is about, and obviously I would like the theatre to be, if it's an adaptation of my books, it's about nudging people's certainties and making them go out with a lot of questions instead of the glib and slick prejudices they brought into the enterprise. So, I mean, so many issues around this. Only I can say that for me it's been a process that's been entirely positive, because it has changed my sense of what I'm doing as a writer.
That's very interesting, because you said that your third novel, I think, or is being changed by this process. And Harriet, you've experienced working on new plays, where you've also had quite an influence on the end result, the end play. How has it changed? Has it just been watching the actors?
It's a two-way process, really. One challenge a writer of historical fiction has is to stay with your characters in the present moment and not be seduced by hindsight, zipping to the end of the process from where you can point a moral and adorn a tale, from where you pass judgment. So watching your drama enacted live on stage is a great corrective to hindsight. It pins you to the present moment. It pins you to the heartbeat, to the breath, which is where you want to be. Watching the actors gives me insight into the characters, but also the things that they will tell me about their process. There are, and this is one of Mike's particular inspirations, there are times in the play when, both plays, when silence does its work. And the power of silence is immense and exquisite. But in that silence, your actor has time to back off into his own thoughts and to allow images to arise. If, as it may be, your actor emails you in the interval and tells you what was going on in that silence, then to a writer it's a gift.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It is, because you've got the images then, you've got... It's like being able to... It's the directness of it, it's the spontaneity of it. And then you have this wonderful present in your hand. You didn't expect to get that. And it jerks you out of your preconceptions. All your ideas about how a thing was going to be, they go out of the window and you get a fresh start. Wow. And when you're on the third volume of a trilogy, you could get a little bit set in your ways. You've got your techniques, you've got your shtick. You think you know how these people work. And then one of these people tells you something utterly surprising. Throw all your ideas out of the window and start again. So it's a continual, it's a shared creativity. It's an absolute privilege to be able to work in that way.
I was wondering whether, when you carry on writing anything after, the third book, you will be visualizing, Ben in the part of Thomas Cromwell. Does it affect you, the voice and the appearance of the actor who's played the part? Because what's wonderful about reading a book, when you're just privately reading a book, is it can be your own imagination of how somebody is. As soon as an actor embodies it, it sort of somehow confines the imagination and sets it in some kind of physical form that you...
Well, that's a question people always ask, because it disturbs people sometimes that they're not lookalikes. And it actually doesn't affect me, because when I'm writing my characters, I'm not... when a friend comes into a room, you don't go, oh, there is Harriet Walter with her short bobbed hair, her typical elegance, her wonderful high cheekbones. You just go, that's Harriet Walter. You don't do it by adding eyes to nose to mouth. You just recognise your friends. And it's the same for me when you're working on a character in a book. It's not their physical features, even their build, it's their energy. And so I don't feel that to put an actor into a role in any way imposes on my imagination. And I feel that when those actors are gone, that energy will still remain, and I will recognise it when it comes into the room.
Yeah, that's interesting, because now I'm thinking about it, I did say in the book about Macbeth that even though I'd accomplished some kind of Lady Macbeth, it's like I sort of sign off, curtain call, last performance, and there she is again. She carries on forever. Somebody else is going, she's there, she's elemental, she's out there, and somebody else is going to embody her. I haven't sort of narrowed her down in any way, but yeah.
I want to, I want to open this up to the audience. I just have a last quick question, because I want to go back. I want to talk about women and contemporary women. We'll leave history a little bit. Contemporary women, their minds and their bodies. Harriet, you've spoken very openly and very eloquently about aging as a woman, the threat of disappearing from the stage. And Hilary, you've spoken also very eloquently and movingly about changing shape, being perceived differently. And you've also complained about the education of women, which you say turns girls into little chappies with breasts. And there are schools, you say at one point, that train officers, and then there are schools that train life's foolish volunteers. In an experiment in love, you say, if I could time travel, I would fly back to the ironing room and slap these girls and say, leave this, they're ironing or something, leave this, go and run the country. So, is there any hope? I'm asking you both.
It's good. Yeah, it's a better picture than it has ever been, I suppose.
Yes,
Isn't it?
In the passage about little chappies with breasts, I was referring to education in the kind of all-girls school that I went to. And, you think, okay, this is quite a time ago. But, there was a programme that was on TV last year. There was Educating Essex, and then there was a Yorkshire one, I think. And the great battle for teachers is always keeping them in their uniform and trying to stop them subverting the school uniform in some way. And I was looking at these girls in the Yorkshire programme, and it's just like when I was in school, the girls were wearing shirts and ties.
It hasn't
what
changed.
Is that about?
Yeah, no, it's strange. It is strange. And
you live the first, 16, 18 years of your life as a transvestite. From the waist up.
Did you feel? Yeah.
I just feel we've got a poor imagination about what, playing, as I said, leaders, but having to play them mainly in male roles. There's a sort of paucity of imagination of what female leadership might be, and whether it be any different, and whether there is a feminizing quality that could be beneficial to society. And I have to say, when you look at the news, there's a lot of testosterone about doing terrible things in the world, and I just wonder whether female leadership or female, one bit of me says we're all the same thing, stop dividing us into male and female, but the other side of me says, well, through our schooling, through centuries and centuries, we have evolved differently, and we have got things to teach one another, and we're not second-class citizens, and it's complicated, but people are, there are fewer people who are going to say, I'm surprised that was written by a woman in the next generation. I think it sort of shifts, and people are getting more muddled, which is good in a way. you know, if you imagine a time not so long ago when women just would not be in certain public roles, they just wouldn't be there. That's got to have changed, hasn't it? And got to change our perceptions and our hopes. I don't quite know if we'll do a better job or what we do, but, you know, it's when we shouldn't be aping men and wearing ties. We're something else. And
I don't know, there has to be a model for women in public life that is not generated out of a male model.
Yeah.
And what we've had in this country is we have Mrs. Thatcher in the mythological guise of Britannia, wearing her breastplate and having a good war to prove herself more masculine than the men. But, you know, we've got a problem about this. I mean, the Germans have Angela Merkel, Mutti, as they call her mummy. We had Maggie Thatcher, milk snatcher. So think about it.
I think if we have two models for women, we certainly have them here. And I'm sure you all have quite a few questions. I'm sorry that we don't have a lot of time, but we do have time for a few questions. So if anyone has a question, I can't see, but I'm sure the lights will come. Yes, Susanna.
What would be the effect of casting women in Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies as Cromwell and so on and so forth? Is it tempting?
I tell you what, I'll go in tomorrow and suggest and give it a go. The actors were, during rehearsal, inured to me coming in at 10 o'clock in the morning with the bright idea I'd had during the night. So I'm sure I could produce that one with a straight face. We'll give it a go and we'll get back to you.
However, I'm sure you love to play Thomas Cromwell, but we'll leave. Are there any other questions?
I'm just going to go.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Hilary how much you've been involved in the forthcoming TV adaptation of Wolf Hall.
Sorry, how much
the question is, have you been involved in the coming TV adaptation? How involved have you been in that?
Owing to the fact that I have not yet developed the faculty of bilocation, I've been in the theatre rather than on set. My involvement in the TV series has been quite light, actually. Where we're up to is filming is done now. We don't have a transmission date. It should go out sometime early next year. It has nothing to do with a theatre production at all. No crossover in terms of writers, actors, different storylines, different characters, and yet both faithfully derived from the same books. So in this instance, we had a very good team with our director and writer. I saw the scripts at an early stage. We talked a lot even before the writing began. There wasn't a great deal for me to do. The only time I saw each episode, I could give some feedback, it would be taken in. The only time they really came to me was when they wanted to put a scene on, they wanted to film a scene which did not exist in the books. So then they'd come say, can you imagine it for us, please? Which was great for me because it gave me the chance to sit down and do some screenwriting. And for instance, we wanted to do some passages. No one can resist a good trial for TV or the stage. So we had to do, they felt we had to do something about Thomas More's trial, or the viewer might feel cheated. So there was a chance to construct an episode that didn't exist in the books. But my involvement there has been comparatively light. I've seen the rushes and it looks really good, but I'm waiting with the same eagerness as everyone else to see what it will look like when it's cut and finished.
Well, we're all looking forward to that. The question here. Wait, the microphone.
I heard a playwright called Arnold Wesker once say that, speaking from his own experience, that there were writers who wrote from the imagination and there were writers who wrote from what they knew, and he was referring to himself in that instance. Given what you've spoken already about imagination, would you agree with that?
Who is the question addressed to? Both, I think.
Both. I mean, to Hilary, but both, actually.
Yeah.
I don't see how you could avoid writing from both if your work is to have any substance, because your imagination informs your interpretation of what you know. You can do very little with cold facts. You have to carry them on to the next stage. So I cannot see how you would divide the process. It is, the advice given to young writers always used to be write what you know. And, don't despise that. There is a certain soundness to it, but you must also be aware that you may know more than you think. And there is a turning point in a writer's life when you realise you know more than you think, or perhaps more than you've acknowledged or admitted. And at that point, you gain authority as a writer. You have a place to stand and speak.
I think as an actor, you can tell quite quickly when you're reading a part whether the writer is writing from what they know or what they've imagined, or, that a bad piece of writing will definitely ring out, this person has never been here and has not imagined it well. And a good, we're quite good litmus tests, actually, because it'll ring true or it won't. Quite quickly we'll know whether they've honestly come at that character.
People imagine, or let me put it another way, people suppose that imagination is an airy quality and that deploying it is a rather genteel exercise that could be performed, for example, by a lady on a chaise longue with her head on her hands like this. It's not like that. To imagine properly, you have to imagine strenuously. It has to come from the gut. It involves your whole body, from the feet up to the top of the head. Imagination, properly understood, it's a physical process. That's where we come together, isn't it?
That's exactly where you come together. And I'm sorry that we can't take more questions. We've run over. But I would like to thank very much Hilary and Harriet for this conversation.